Alexander the Great, Conquest, Empire, and the Edge of the World. Welcome or welcome back to a sleep-in class, where we turn quiet lectures into restful journeys through history, science, invention, and the wider world. Here, curiosity can slow down, the day can loosen its grip, and there's no test waiting at the end. And if there is a sleepy lesson you would like covered in class next, please feel free to leave it in the comments below. Tonight, the classroom opens into the thunder of hooves on old roads and the dust of Macedonian camps. Ahead waits the long shadow of Alexander the Great, a young king whose name traveled farther than his army ever could. He crossed from Greece into Asia with spears and cavalry, with engineers and companions, and with a hunger for glory that no border seemed able to hold for long. But the story does not begin with the conqueror already riding east. It begins before the crossing, before the legend, and before the empire, in a world already being sharpened for conquest. The world before Alexander. Alexander did not step into an empty world. By the time he became king, the road toward conquest had been marked by older rivalries, royal ambition, military reform, and the long shadow of Persia over Greek memory. His life would become extraordinary, but the conditions around him were changing before his name became the one attached to them. Macedon stood north of the older southern Greek city-states, close enough to their politics to be entangled in them, but different enough to be treated uneasily by many people farther south. In places such as Athens, Sparta, and Thebes, Macedon could seem rougher, more royal, and less familiar than the civic traditions of assemblies, rival leagues, and long-established local pride. Yet that northern kingdom held advantages the city-states often lacked. Its kings could draw on timber, horses, land, and mines, while the monarchy could concentrate authority when the ruler was strong enough to hold the nobles, army, and royal house together. That ruler was Philip II, Alexander's father. Philip did not merely leave his son a crown. He reshaped Macedon into the dominant military power of the Greek world by strengthening the army, training it more professionally, and making it work as a combined force rather than a loose gathering of brave men. The Macedonian phalanx carried long sarissas, spears so extended that a wall of points could reach the enemy before shorter weapons could answer. Infantry held the front, while elite mounted companions gave the army speed and striking force. Siegecraft gave Philip another advantage, ways to break cities that earlier armies might only surround and starve. This military system was not a legend built after Alexander's fame. The kingdom Philip made is visible in more than later stories. Macedonian royal tombs, weapons, palace remains, luxury goods, and coinage help show a realm growing richer, more ambitious, and more connected to the wider Eastern Mediterranean. Archaeology cannot tell every private thought of a king, but it can show the material weight of a kingdom preparing to matter. The political landscape around Macedon was divided. Greek cities could produce brilliant art, philosophy, drama, law, and strategy, but they also fought one another again and again. Old rivalries made unity difficult. Athens, Thebes, Sparta, Corinth, and other powers could resist Macedonian control, Yet they could not easily create a stable common front for long. Philip used marriage and diplomacy when they served him, and force when force worked better. Step by step, Macedon moved deeper into Greek affairs. The decisive moment came at Chaeronea in 338 BCE. There, Philip defeated a major coalition that included Athens and Thebes, and Macedon became the leading power in Greece. The battle did not erase Greek identity or end city politics, but it changed the balance of force. After Chaeronea, Philip helped create the League of Corinth, a political arrangement that placed him at the head of a planned campaign against Persia. The idea of invading Asia did not begin as Alexander's private dream. It was policy before Alexander inherited it. Persia was not a weak background empire waiting politely to fall. The Achaemenid Empire was old, wealthy, and vast. Royal roads tied distant lands to the center. Satraps governed provinces. Tribute systems, treasuries, court traditions, and administrators helped the empire rule many peoples across Anatolia, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, Egypt at times, and territories farther east. To treat Persia as merely the stage for Alexander's rise would miss the scale of what he chose to attack. Greek memory gave that attack emotional force. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Plataea had become names with weight. They preserved older struggles between Greek forces and Persian kings, even as later cities still made deals, received support, and fought under the influence of Persian money or diplomacy. Persia could be enemy, patron, threat, opportunity, and old imperial neighbor all at once. Philip understood that a war against Persia could be framed as revenge, liberation, ambition, and unity at the same time. Then, in 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated before he could lead the campaign himself. The throne passed to Alexander, but what passed with it was larger than kingship. He inherited a hardened army, a Greek world forced into Macedon's orbit, and a war whose target waited across the water. If you are enjoying this quiet lesson on conquest, legend, and the ancient world, please subscribe for more calm journeys through history and science. The world before Alexander had been sharpened for him. Now, the question becomes what kind of young king could inherit that weapon, hold it, and turn it toward Asia, Macedon, and the making of a king. Alexander was born in 356 BCE at Pella, the royal center of Macedon. He entered a house where power did not rest quietly. Macedonian rule could look magnificent from the outside, with horses, weapons, marriages, gold, feasts, and public display. But beneath that splendor stood a dangerous political system. A ruler had to command the army, manage nobles, survive rival claimants, and keep the royal family from breaking into factions. Alexander was born into privilege, but not into safety. His father, Philip II, had built the kingdom into a weapon. His mother, Olympias, came from Epirus, a region west of Macedon with its own royal traditions and sacred associations. Those facts are secure enough, while the stories around them are more difficult. Later accounts surrounded Olympias with omens, religious intensity, suspicion, and dramatic scenes. so those details need careful handling. They show how people tried to explain Alexander's rise after the fact as much as they reveal Olympias herself. Alexander grew up between powerful parents whose marriage carried politics, ambition, and danger. Ancient writers shaped Alexander's childhood into signs of future greatness, telling stories of confidence, temper, courage, and destiny. Some tales may preserve memory, others polish a ruler into legend after everyone already knows the ending. The famous horse, Bucephalus, belongs to that kind of material, useful for understanding how tradition saw Alexander, but not a foundation strong enough to carry much historical weight by itself. A child becomes a symbol more easily after the man has conquered an empire. Still, Alexander received the kind of formation that could prepare a prince for command. Around the age of 13, Aristotle began teaching him, bringing one of the most famous minds of the Greek world into the education of a Macedonian heir. That education likely exposed Alexander to literature, philosophy, science, politics, medicine, and heroic tradition. Aristotle did not single-handedly create Alexander, and no teacher explains a conqueror by himself. The connection matters because it placed Alexander inside a cultivated Greek intellectual world, even while he remained a Macedonian prince trained for war. Heroic models also mattered. Alexander was later linked strongly with Achilles, the warrior of the Iliad, and that association gave his life a language of glory, rage, honor, and deathless fame. The danger is to treat that connection as if it explains everything. It does not. Instead, it shows the kind of story Alexander and later writers could use to frame ambition. In a world where public image mattered, old heroes gave young rulers a way to understand themselves and to be understood by others. Alexander's training was not only literary. Macedonian command expected a prince to ride, hunt, judge character, and survive among men who respected courage, but also watched weakness closely. The court was a school, but it was also a contest. Around the young prince stood companions, nobles, guards, relatives, envoys, and officers, each part of a world where favor and danger lived close together. In that setting, education did not end at books. It continued in feasts, campaigns, ceremonies, rivalries, and the daily performance of authority. At about 16, Alexander was left in charge of Macedonia while Philip campaigned. Regency gave him more than ceremonial practice. It placed him before soldiers, administrators, and local threats while his father was away. A young prince had to show that command could pass through him without the kingdom weakening. Ancient accounts also describe him acting against a local revolt during this period, which fits the larger picture of a teenager being tested inside the machinery of Macedonian rule. Yet, no training could make succession safe. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated. The murder did not simply end one reign and begin another. It opened a dangerous moment when rivals, noble factions, foreign enemies, and Greek cities could all test whether the new ruler could hold what his father had built. Alexander was about 20 years old. Youth could be a weakness if the army doubted him, if nobles hesitated, or if Greece decided Macedonian command had died with Philip. Alexander moved quickly. He secured the throne, removed threats, and forced recognition at home and abroad. The speed matters because Macedonian monarchy did not give him the luxury of slow legitimacy. A king had to become undeniable before others organized against him. The young Alexander inherited Philip's army, but inheritance alone did not guarantee obedience. He had to prove that the weapon could still be held. The harshest proof came at Thebes in 335 BCE. When Thebes rose against Macedonian control, Alexander answered with overwhelming force. The city was destroyed, and the punishment became a warning to the rest of Greece. That act should not be softened into mere strategy. It was brutal, and it shows that Alexander's story of legend and conquest also begins with terror used as policy. After Thebes, the League of Corinth and the planned campaign against Persia remained in place. Alexander had survived the first test of kingship. He was no longer only Philip's son, Aristotle's student, or the prince later stories would dress in signs of destiny. He had become a ruling Macedonian king, formed by fear, ceremony, crisis, and command. Now the army, alliance, and war plan Philip left behind could be carried across the water, the road into Persia. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia. The narrow waterway separated the world he had secured from the empire he meant to attack. Behind him stood the Macedonian kingdom his father had built, and the Greek political order now forced into its orbit. Ahead stood the Achaemenid Persian Empire, whose lands reached across Asia Minor and far beyond it. Alexander entered Asia as a young king, carrying an inherited war, a political claim, and an army designed for movement. The invasion could be described in Greek terms as revenge for earlier Persian invasions and liberation for Greek cities under Persian control. That language gave the war a public story, but the army that moved into Asia was not only an instrument of memory. Its phalanx infantry carried long sarissas, while companion cavalry gave the force speed. Scouts helped it move, engineers helped it cross obstacles, and siege specialists helped it pressure cities that refused to yield. The army could fight in open battle, move through hostile territory, and turn resistance into a practical problem. Ancient tradition also connected Alexander with Troy and Achilles, placing his march inside older heroic language that later writers enjoyed shaping into legend. The symbolism still belonged to the campaign's public face. The king who crossed into Asia could present himself as heir to Greek memory, Macedonian power, and heroic ambition at once. The first major test came at the Granicus River in 334 BCE, where Persian satraps and Greek mercenaries opposed him in Asia Minor. Alexander answered with the aggression that would become part of his command image, and ancient accounts describe a dangerous cavalry fight near the river, with the king personally exposed to serious risk. Although the exact battle drama comes through later narrative tradition, the larger result is clear. Granicus gave Alexander his first major victory on Persian soil, and helped open much of Asia Minor to Macedonian rule. After Granicus, cities across the region faced a choice. Some could welcome Alexander, especially where his promise of Greek liberation carried political use. Others resisted, negotiated, or waited to see which side would last. Alexander's language of liberation did not mean that cities became free in a simple modern sense. Persian authority might be removed, but Macedonian authority followed close behind. Conquest often arrived wearing the language of freedom, and the people inside each city still had to live with the rule that came next. This is why the evidence needs care. The broad sequence is historically secure, but many speeches, gestures, and battlefield details come from later Greek and Roman writers. Material traces such as coinage, inscriptions, city histories, and administrative changes can show control spreading after victory, but they do not preserve every private motive or every word spoken in the field. The road into Persia is known through a mixture of narrative memory and harder political evidence. Darius III entered the story more directly at Issus in 333 BCE. Unlike Granicus, this was not only a fight against regional Persian commanders. The great king himself had come close enough to become the center of the drama. Alexander defeated Darius at Issus, and the king's retreat gave the Macedonian success enormous symbolic force. When Darius's family fell into Alexander's hands, conquest, reputation, and royal behavior met in one charged moment. Ancient tradition presents Alexander treating them with care, a choice that served both humanity and politics. A conqueror who wanted to rule an empire needed more than victory. He needed to appear worthy of command. Issus did not end the war. Darius still lived, Persia still had resources, and Alexander still had to choose whether to chase the king inland or secure the coast. He moved south along the eastern Mediterranean, where naval bases, ports, and resistant cities could threaten his rear if left alone. The campaign became more than a line of battles. It became a hard process of roads, negotiations, sieges, punishments, and public messages. Alexander had to make victory visible across territory, not only win it on a field. Tyre showed the cost of that process in 332 BCE. When the island city resisted, Alexander answered with engineering and endurance, building a causeway toward the city, bringing siege equipment forward, and turning a difficult coastal obstacle into a brutal demonstration of persistence. Tyre was not a soft episode in a heroic march. It was long, destructive, and violent. Its fall warned other cities what refusal could cost, while also showing that Alexander's army could adapt when ordinary battle was not enough. By the time the road led south toward Egypt, the war had become Alexander's own project. Granicus had proved that he could win in Asia. Issus had brought him face to face with the Persian king. Tyre had shown that resistance could be broken by engineering as well as cavalry. Step by step, the young ruler was learning that conquest required more than courage. It required image, engineering, punishment, patience, and control. The next stage would not be only only another military advance. In Egypt, Alexander would meet an older language of rule, shaped by temples, priests, kings, and sacred claims. The road into Persia had made him a victorious invader. Egypt would begin turning victory into a different kind of power. Egypt, Ammon, and the image of power. After Tyre, Alexander entered Egypt in 332 BCE. The move was military, but Egypt demanded more than another advance. Until then, he had fought through roads, cities, coastal resistance, and the forces tied to Darius III. A conqueror could win a crossing or a siege, but ruling Egypt required entry into one of the oldest languages of kingship in the ancient world. The land had lived under Persian rule, and Alexander could be received by some as a liberator from that rule. That did not make him merely a guest or a rescuer. He became ruler. Liberation could describe the way control changed hands, but it did not erase control itself. Persian authority gave way, and Alexander had to show that Macedonian authority could fit inside Egyptian political and sacred tradition. In Egypt, kingship was not only a matter of armies and commands. It belonged to temple ritual, priestly recognition, sacred images, and the long memory of pharaohs. A ruler needed recognition in forms the land already understood. Alexander seems to have accepted that need. He did not govern by pretending Macedon had replaced everything before it. Instead, he entered an older symbolic system where politics and sacred order stood close together. Egypt became a turning point in Alexander's image. He had already been a Macedonian king, a leader of Greeks, and an invader of Persian territory. There, he could also appear in forms compatible with pharaonic rule. The same man could carry different meanings in different lands. That flexibility did not make conquest gentle, but it made conquest more durable. Armies could take cities. Symbols could help secure them. In 331 BCE, Alexander founded Alexandria near the Mediterranean coast. This should not become a retelling of that city's later library, lighthouse, or Ptolemaic glory. Those belong to another story. Here, Alexandria matters because it shows Alexander using foundation itself as a political act. A new city could anchor a coastline, carry a royal name, organize movement, and project rule into the future. Even before Alexandria became famous, its founding showed that Alexander was not only passing through conquered land, but marking it. The journey to the Siwa oasis deepened the change in image. There, Alexander visited the oracle of Susa, or Ammon, where Greek and Egyptian religious language met in a powerful form. Ancient accounts connect this visit with claims that Alexander was recognized as more than an ordinary king, sometimes in language of divine sonship. That point needs caution. We cannot turn an oracle story into a transcript of Alexander's private belief. Ancient kingship often used sacred language publicly, and later writers had reason to make the moment sound larger than life. Still, the Siwa story gave Alexander another layer of meaning. His connection to Ammon survived after him, especially in later royal imagery and coinage. Coins and portraits do not show us his soul, but they do show how rulers wanted him remembered. The ram horn of Ammon became one of the signs through which later audiences could recognize an Alexander who was more than a battlefield commander. His image could be made divine, heroic, royal, and useful to successors who claimed power in his shadow. Egypt, therefore, reveals a different side of the conquest. Alexander did not only defeat enemies, he learned how to step into local systems of legitimacy and make them speak in his favor. That process could involve respect, calculation, adaptation, and domination at the same time. A conqueror who ignored local traditions might win quickly and govern badly. One who could borrow sacred forms, found cities, and accept priestly recognition could turn victory into authority. By the time Alexander left Egypt, he had gained more than territory. He remained the Macedonian king and Greek avenger who had entered Asia. But Egypt gave him another face, a ruler in pharaonic form, marked by Ammon, and increasingly able to make conquered traditions serve imperial power. Now, the road turned back toward Persia, where Darius still lived and the empire itself waited to be decided. Gaugamela and the fall of the Persian king. After Egypt, Alexander turned back toward the heart of Persian power. The question was no longer only how far he could invade. He now had to face the great king again and decide whether victory would become a claim to empire. The decisive battle came at Gaugamela in 331 BCE. Darius gathered a large force and prepared ground where wide space could serve the movements of his army. Ancient accounts give dramatic details about the size of the armies and the arrangement of the field, but those details come through later writers and need caution. The larger structure is secure enough. At Gaugamela, Alexander faced Darius directly, broke the effective military power of the Achaemenid king, and won the imperial question in a way no earlier victory had done. That victory did not mean that every fortress, road, treasury, and province instantly obeyed him. Empires do not vanish in a single afternoon, but the battle changed the center of gravity. Darius fled again, and Alexander could move into the great royal cities not as a raider at the edge, but as the man who had defeated the king in the open. Babylon received Alexander after Gaugamela. Older than Macedon's rise, it stood as one of the great symbolic centers of the ancient Near East, heavy with imperial memory. Babylonian evidence gives historians a wider angle on Alexander's entry into this world. The story is not preserved only by Greek and Roman voices looking back. Local records and regional evidence help show that Alexander had entered a political landscape with its own institutions, calendars, priesthoods, and expectations. Susa opened its treasuries next, and Persian royal resources came into Macedonian hands on a scale that changed the campaign. Money could pay soldiers, reward loyalty, support movement, hire specialists, and turn conquest into administration. Treasure was fuel for rule, not only glitter. The Macedonian king who had crossed into Asia with an army now held resources gathered by generations of Persian government. Persepolis followed as the charged ceremonial heart of Persian royal power. If Babylon showed the depth of the conquered world, and Susa showed its wealth, Persepolis showed its royal image. Its palaces, terraces, reliefs, and monumental stone presented the Achaemenid order as vast, formal, and enduring. Alexander's arrival there placed him inside the visual language of the dynasty he had defeated. The burning of Persepolis became one of the most famous and debated moments of the campaign. Ancient writers give different tones and explanations. Some traditions frame it as revenge for Persian destruction in Greece long before. Others connect it with drunkenness, spectacle, or political theater. The safest course is caution. The fire happened within a world of revenge language, royal symbolism, and conquest. But we should not pretend to know a single clean motive. Whatever its cause, the burning marked Persepolis as more than a captured palace. It became a sign that the old royal center had been broken, punished, or ritually ended. Yet, even after Gaugamela and Persepolis, Darius still lived. Alexander could not fully claim to have replaced the Persian king, while the king remained somewhere ahead of him. The pursuit carried the campaign beyond the great ceremonial centers and into the question of legitimacy. Darius was no longer only a battlefield opponent. He became a living problem for Alexander's claim to rule. 330 BCE, Darius was killed by Bessus, one of his own commanders and relatives. Bessus then tried to claim authority for himself. For Alexander, this changed the moral language of the campaign. He could present himself not merely as the conqueror of Darius, but as the avenger of a murdered king against a usurper. It allowed Alexander to step deeper into Persian royal logic, punishing disloyalty to the king he had fought, and claiming that imperial order now passed through himself. Conquest now became rule in a more demanding sense. Alexander had not simply defeated Persia from outside. He began acting as the one who would inherit, occupy, interpret, and command the empire. Titles often summarized as King of Asia expressed that larger claim. He had to govern lands with old systems, powerful elites, royal memories, and populations that did not become Macedonian just because a battle had been lost. That shift created tension among his own followers. Macedonian and Greek companions had followed a king who promised war against Persia. Now they were watching him enter Persian palaces, use Persian wealth, punish Persian rebels, and claim Persian kingship in new forms. To some, this could look like victory becoming contamination. To Alexander, it could look like the necessary shape of empire. A ruler of Asia could not remain only the commander of Macedonians. By the end of this stage, the old Persian king was dead. The great treasuries had changed hands, and the royal centers had been entered, claimed, or burned. But the empire did not become simple. A conquered empire still had to be occupied, funded, interpreted, and held. The road now led beyond Persia's old heartlands, where distance, resistance, and Macedonian expectations would test whether Alexander's new empire could ever sit still. The empire that would not sit still. After the fall of Darius, Alexander had won the Persian throne in theory, but the lands beyond Persia's heartlands remained difficult. The old royal centers had been entered, yet the eastern reaches still demanded roads, garrisons, punishment, negotiation, and constant movement. The campaigns pushed east into Bactria and Sogdia, regions that resisted easy control. These were not empty spaces at the edge of the map. They held fortified places, local elites, difficult terrain, and communities with their own political loyalties. Distance itself became part of the struggle. As Alexander moved farther from Macedon, Greece, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, conquest became a matter of roads, supplies, garrisons, alliances, and local resistance. Winning a great battle had been hard. Holding a scattered dominion was harder in a quieter, slower way. Bessus stood at the center of the first Eastern challenge. After Darius's death, he claimed authority for himself, taking on royal meaning in the lands still outside Alexander's firm control. If Bessus survived as a rival claimant, the death of Darius would not settle the question of succession. His capture and punishment allowed Alexander to present himself again as the defender of legitimate kingship against betrayal and usurpation. That language was useful, but it did not make the eastern campaigns easy. In these regions, Alexander founded or refounded cities, many carrying the name Alexandria. Those foundations were not only monuments to his ego, though they certainly carried his name into the landscape. They functioned as garrisons, administrative anchors, settlement points, and signs that a new order would remain behind. A city could hold soldiers, watch routes, support officials, and turn a line of march into a structure of control. The exact identification of some Alexandrias remains difficult, and the evidence can be scattered. Alexander was not only passing through, he was trying to fasten rule to place. Local politics also entered his household. In 327 BCE, Alexander married Roxana, a woman from the eastern Iranian world, often associated with Sogdian or Bactrian elite connections. The marriage should not be reduced to romance. It tied Alexander to local aristocratic politics and helped present him as a ruler joined to the world he had conquered. At the same time, it placed him farther from the expectations of some Macedonians who had followed him east as their commander, not necessarily as a monarch remaking himself into an Eastern sovereign. That tension grew around court style. Alexander adopted elements of Persian royal dress and ceremony, trying to govern lands much larger than Macedonian custom alone could manage. To him, these forms could look practical or even necessary. A ruler of Asia had to be recognized by people who understood kingship through distance, display, and formal court behavior. To many Macedonian companions, however, such changes could feel like betrayal. They had fought beside a king who was supposed to lead them as first among warriors. Now, he seemed to be raising himself into a more remote position. The controversy over proskenses, a form of court obeisance or prostration, made this strain visible. In Persian court culture, bodily gestures before the king could express hierarchy and royal honor. Among Greeks and Macedonians, similar gestures could sound dangerously close to treating a human ruler like a god. The conflict was not only about etiquette. It was about what kind of King Alexander was becoming, and whether his old companions could still recognize their place near him. the empire was larger than the habits of the army that conquered it. Court conflict turned darker as pressure gathered around Alexander. The Philotas affair in 330 BCE brought accusation, suspicion, and execution into the circle of command. Philotas, the son of Parmenion, was executed after being accused in connection with conspiracy. Parmenion, one of Philip's old generals and a powerful figure in the army, was then killed because his position made him dangerous after his son's fall. The broad sequence is central, but the emotional details come through later narratives and hostile political memory. Size, danger, and distance sharpened mistrust inside the command structure itself. In 328 BCE, that tension took another form when Alexander killed Cletus the Black during a drunken quarrel. Cletus had once saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, which made the killing even more terrible in later memory. The scene is often told dramatically by ancient writers, and those details need caution. But the core event shows a court where conquest, pride, wine, memory, and anger could become fatal. This was not only expansion across geography, it was pressure inside the human circle that had carried the campaign. Callisthenes also became linked with court opposition, especially around the dispute over Proskenses and the limits of Alexander's royal image. Ancient sources differ on details of his fate, with accounts involving death in custody or execution after suspicion fell on him. Again, the exact emotional scene is difficult to hold with certainty. The larger pattern is clearer. As Alexander's kingship stretched toward world empire, speech around the king became dangerous, and disagreement could become treason. By the time Alexander looked farther east, victory over Darius had created problems victory alone could not solve. Bactria and Sogdia had resisted. The Alexandrias tried to fasten rule to place. Roxana's marriage joined conquest to local power. Persian ceremony widened the gap between imperial scale and Macedonian comradeship. Inside the court, death and suspicion showed the cost of danger and command. The road now turned toward India, where elephants, unfamiliar kingdoms, and exhausted soldiers would reveal a different limit to conquest, to India and the edge of the army. After Bactria and Sogdia, Alexander kept moving east. The road carried him toward the Indus and the Punjab, into the northwestern Indian subcontinent around 327 to 326 BCE. To Macedonian soldiers, this was becoming the farthest reach of the campaign. But India was not an empty edge waiting for Alexander to arrive. It held kingdoms, armies, fortified places, rivers, and political worlds with their own histories. As the army advanced, the story leaned further into distance and uncertainty. Greek and Roman writers preserve much of Alexander's Indian campaign, but the evidence is thinner and more indirect than for some earlier stages. The broad outline is clear enough. Alexander entered a complex region, fought powerful opponents, and reached a point where the will of his own soldiers became the limit of the advance, while the exact speeches, emotional scenes, and some geography come through traditions that need careful handling. The great battle of this stage came at the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, where Alexander fought King Porus. The river itself mattered. Crossing water against an alert enemy was dangerous, and ancient accounts emphasize the difficulty of surprise and timing across difficult conditions. Porus did not appear as a weak figure in an empty land. He came as a ruler with his own army and with war elephants, animals that carried tactical force and psychological weight for soldiers who had marched far beyond the familiar world of Macedon. The elephants changed the texture of battle. Horses could panic near them, and infantry had to face living towers of muscle, tusk, noise, and movement. Ancient narratives remember the elephants because they made the field feel unfamiliar and threatening. They were not the only force that mattered, but they marked the Macedonian army's entry into a military world with unfamiliar tools and sharper fear. Alexander won at the Hydaspes. The tradition, he respected Porus afterward and allowed him to continue ruling under Macedonian authority. That story fits a larger pattern in Alexander's career. He could destroy, punish, and terrorize when resistance demanded a warning. But he could also preserve local rulers when their loyalty served the larger structure of empire. The Porus tradition should not be treated as a private transcript of noble feeling. It works best as a political scene, victory followed by incorporation. If Bucephalus belongs anywhere in the story after childhood, it belongs here. Alexander's famous horse is said to have died around this campaign, and later memory linked the loss to the far eastern reach of the conquest. The details are not equally secure in every telling, but the image is useful. The horse associated with Alexander's youth and command disappears near the edge of the army's willingness. Alexander wanted to continue east, and the old hunger for movement had not left him. Beyond the Hyphasis River, also known as the Bias, there were still more lands, rulers, and armies ahead. To him, the campaign might still seem unfinished. To the soldiers, the horizon looked different. They had marched for years, crossed mountains and rivers, fought in strange climates, endured wounds, watched comrades die, and faced the thought that every victory only opened the road to another war. At the Hyphasis, the army refused to go farther. This was one of the clearest limits Alexander ever faced. He had not been defeated by an enemy in a final battlefield collapse, but stopped by the exhaustion and refusal of the machine that had carried him. The soldiers were not simply cowardly or disloyal. Their refusal grew from distance, monsoon conditions, fear of more elephants, unfamiliar enemies, and the terrible possibility that war had no visible end. That moment changes the meaning of the edge of the world. It was not a literal edge where the earth stopped. It was the edge of obedience, endurance, and belief. Alexander could command many things, but he could not command an army to want forever. The advance had reached the place where royal desire and human limits split apart. The return did not bring easy relief. Alexander led forces down the Indus and eventually through the Gedrosian Desert, or Makron, a route remembered for heavy suffering. Heat, thirst, hunger, terrain, and exhaustion turned the journey back into another kind of trial. The army that had crossed into Asia as an instrument of conquest now carried the cost of conquest in its own bodies. By the time Alexander turned west, he had reached his farthest human limit. He had defeated Porus, entered the northwestern Indian world, and stood at the river where his own soldiers refused the next step. The empire had stretched from Macedon through Persia and toward India, but it had not become infinite. The road now bent back toward Babylon, where victory, fatigue, succession, and legend would gather around Alexander's final days. Death, division, and legend. After India and the hard return west, Alexander reached Babylon. The city that had once marked his entrance into the old imperial world now became the place where his empire gathered around a dying king. Victory had not brought stillness. It had brought a realm too large to rest easily in one pair of hands. In 323 BCE, Alexander died in Babylon at the age of 32. Britannica gives June 13th, 323 BCE as the date. His death became one of the great unresolved moments of ancient history, not because the fact itself is uncertain, but because its cause remains debated. Ancient accounts describe illness and decline after heavy drinking, while modern arguments have considered disease, poisoning, infection, and other explanations. The safer historical position is caution. We should not claim certainty where the evidence does not give it. Babylonian records matter here because they offer a window from the imperial world Alexander entered, not only from later Greek and Roman memory. The Babylonian astronomical diaries and related evidence help anchor events around Babylon in local record keeping, though they do not solve every mystery of his final illness or turn the death scene into a medical report. They remind us that Alexander's end happened inside a living city with its own records, observers, and political stakes. The succession problem appeared immediately. Alexander had no stable adult heir ready to command the empire. His half-brother Philip III, or Hydias, could be used in succession politics, but he was not a simple solution. While Roxana was pregnant with the son, who would be born after Alexander's death as Alexander IV. A state built through speed, charisma, conquest, and personal command suddenly had to survive without the man who had held its army, court, treasuries, and ambitions together. A famous tradition claims that Alexander left the empire to the strongest, but that line should be handled carefully. It may preserve later memory more than secure bedside fact. The exact words are less secure than the result. Power did not pass cleanly into one stable system. It fractured among commanders, royal relatives, soldiers, companions, and regional interests. The empire had been conquered by one king, but it could not be inherited so easily by one successor. The generals and companions who struggled over the aftermath became known as the Diadochi, the successors. Their wars did not simply continue Alexander's dream in a neat line. They broke his world empire apart. Over time, major Hellenistic kingdoms emerged, including Ptolemaic Egypt, Seleucid Asia, and Antigonid Macedonia. These were not tiny remnants of failure. They were powerful states in their own right. They also showed that the empire Alexander had made could survive him only by becoming something else. The Hellenistic world that followed should not be treated as simple Greek replacement. Alexander's campaigns created routes of contact across Greece, Egypt, the Near East, Persia, and India. But contact did not erase local cultures. Cities, armies, courts, trade, language, art, coinage, religion, and administration mixed unevenly with older traditions that continued, adapted, resisted, and reshaped what came after. Hellenistic culture was not a clean wave washing over the East. It was power, settlement, exchange, conflict, and continuity all at once. Coins and royal imagery show how Alexander's image outlived his political structure. Successors could use his face, symbols, name, and memory to strengthen their own claims. The ram horn of Ammon, youthful portraits, heroic associations, and royal display helped turn him into something more portable than a living ruler. A coin could carry him where his body no longer could, and portraits could make memory look permanent. Rulers who fought one another could still borrow the same dead king. Legend carried him farther. Alexander became a figure not only in Greek and Roman histories, but in Persian, Arabic, medieval European, and other traditions. The Alexander romance transformed him into a seeker, philosopher king, world conqueror, and traveler among marvels. These stories are not straightforward campaign history. They show how later cultures used him to think about kingship, knowledge, conquest, curiosity, and the limits of human power. The second life of Alexander's name outlasted the empire itself. The historical king died young in Babylon, leaving a broken succession and an empire that split into competing kingdoms. The legendary Alexander kept traveling. He could be admired, condemned, moralized, Christianized, folded into Islamic tradition, romanticized, or turned into a warning. Each age found a different Alexander because the real one had left behind facts and gaps. Cities, ruins, coins, names, victories, massacres, records, and rumors. By the end, Alexander's story is not only the rise of a brilliant commander, it is the arc of a prepared Macedonian war machine moving through a vast Persian world, gathering symbols in Egypt, claiming kingship in Asia, and stopping at the limit of its own army. His empire did not remain whole. His legend did. The political structure fractured after Babylon, but the image of Alexander kept moving through languages, kingdoms, books, coins, and memory, farther than the army itself had ever gone. Alexander began as a young king in a dangerous Macedonian world, but his path carried him far beyond the kingdom he inherited. It crossed old Greek rivalries, the Persian imperial world, Egypt's sacred images, the royal cities of Asia, the hard resistance of Central Asia, and the river where his own army finally refused to go farther. After Babylon, kingdoms rose from the fracture, and later ages kept reshaping his name. Coins, portraits, histories, and legends carried Alexander beyond the army that had once followed him. So the question he leaves behind is not only how far one person can go, it is what remains after conquest has spent itself, the broken kingdoms, the borrowed symbols, the names on cities, the stories that outlive armies, and the human limit waiting at the edge of ambition. For more quiet lessons through history, science, and the wider world, please subscribe. If you are still awake, another quiet lesson will be waiting when you are ready. And if sleep has already found you, you are welcome to stay here soundly, asleep in class.